A biased teacher, a silent classroom, a twist of fate that no one saw coming. Prejudice wears many masks in the halls of elite education. But today, everything changes at Westfield High. Get ready for a story that will expose what really happens when discrimination meets unexpected justice behind closed classroom doors. The bell rings. The morning sun cast long shadows through the windows of Westfield High School as Emma Chen stood before room 204, her new APUS history classroom. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her leather messenger bag, a gift from her father for her 16th birthday, as she took a deep breath, steadying herself for what lay ahead. The hallway buzzed with the usual morning chaos. Locker doors slamming, sneakers squeaking against polished floors, and dozens of conversations merging into a constant hum. But to Emma, it all felt distant, muffled by the pounding of her own heart. Just another new school, she whispered to herself, a mantra she'd repeated too many times over the years. Her father's career had taken them across 3 states, and each time she'd learned to adapt. But something about Westfield felt different. Maybe it was the prestigious reputation, or perhaps the way some students had already given her curious glances, their eyes lingering a moment too long on her face. As Emma reached for the door handle, the bell rang, its shrill tone making her jump. She quickly composed herself and stepped inside. 25 pairs of eyes immediately turned to her, studying, assessing, judging. At the front of the room stood Miss Parker, a woman in her mid-40s with perfectly styled blonde hair and a pressed navy blazer. Her lips curved into what might have been intended as a smile, but there was something cold in her pale blue eyes. "Well," Ms. Parker's voice cut through the silence, "it seems we have a new addition to our class." She consulted a paper on her desk with exaggerated care. "Emma? Chen, is it?" The way she paused before Emma's surname made several students shift uncomfortably in their seats. Emma nodded, maintaining eye contact despite the urge to look away. "Yes, ma'am." "How interesting." Ms. Parker's smile didn't reach her eyes. "I trust you're prepared for the rigorous nature of APUS history. We maintain very high standards here at Westfield." The emphasis on very high standards hung in the air like a challenge. Emma straightened her shoulders, channeling the quiet confidence her father had always encouraged. "Yes, Ms. Parker. History was my strongest subject at my previous school." A slight frown crossed Ms. Parker's features, quickly masked. "We'll see about that. Take a seat. There's one in the back." As Emma made her way to the empty desk, she caught fragments of whispered conversations. Did you see how Parker looked at her? Another diversity admit, probably. "Shh, she might hear you." The plastic chair creaked as Emma sat down, careful to keep her expression neutral despite the heat rising in her cheeks. She pulled out her notebook, crisp and new, just like everything else in her life right now, and wrote the date at the top of the page. Ms. Parker turned to the whiteboard, marker squeaking as she wrote in large letters, "Civil War Reconstruction, Myths and Realities." "Now then," she announced, turning back to face the class, "who can tell me about the positive aspects of Reconstruction?" Her eyes deliberately skipped over Emma's raised hand, settling instead on a blonde girl in the front row. "Yes, Sarah?" As Sarah began reciting what sounded like a memorized textbook passage, Emma slowly lowered her hand. She glanced around the room, taking in the expensive backpacks, the designer shoes, the casual displays of privilege that marked Westfield as one of the most exclusive public schools in the state. A folded piece of paper landed on her desk, expertly flicked from 2 rows over. Emma hesitated before opening it, already guessing its contents. Inside, in neat handwriting, were the words, "Wrong classroom?" She crumpled the note silently, letting it fall into her bag. As Ms. Parker continued the lesson, Emma's pen moved across her notebook, taking detailed notes, even as she felt the teacher's dismissive gaze pass over her again and again. She'd faced prejudice before, but something about Ms. Parker's calculated indifference sent a chill down her spine. What Emma didn't know, couldn't know, was that this was only the beginning. In the coming weeks, that chill would grow into a storm that would shake Westfield High to its very foundations. 2 weeks into the semester, the pattern had become clear. Every raised hand ignored, every comment dismissed, every paper returned with harsh red marks that seemed to appear more frequently on Emma's work than anyone else's. The autumn morning started like any other, but there was an electricity in the air as Ms. Parker strode into the classroom, a stack of graded essays clutched to her chest. Her heels clicked against the linoleum floor with military precision. "Today," she announced, her voice carrying that false sweetness that made Emma's stomach churn, "we'll be discussing your analysis of Andrew Johnson's impeachment. Some of you," her eyes flickered meaningfully toward Emma, "seem to have rather controversial interpretations of historical events." The essays slapped down on desks, one by one. When Ms. Parker reached Emma's desk, she held the paper between 2 fingers as if it might bite. "Miss Chen, perhaps in your previous educational environment, personal opinions were confused with historical facts." Emma's heart stopped as she saw the glaring D marked at the top of her paper. Below it, Ms. Parker had written, in her sharp red pen, "Inappropriate modern political bias. Stick to established historical interpretations." "But Ms. Parker," Emma spoke up, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands, "I cited 3 different historical sources about the racial motivations behind—" "That's quite enough," Ms. Parker cut her off. "This is AP US History, not Social Justice 101. See me after class." Snickers erupted from several corners of the room. Emma caught Sarah, the blonde girl from the front row, shooting her a sympathetic glance before quickly looking away. The rest of the class passed in a blur of humiliation. As students filed out for lunch, Emma approached Ms. Parker's desk, her graded essay clutched tightly in her hand. "Miss Chen," Ms. Parker said without looking up from her computer, "your persistent attempts to inject modern political agendas into historical discussions are becoming a problem." "With respect, Ms. Parker," Emma replied, fighting to keep her voice level, "my essay discussed documented historical events. The sources I cited—" "Let me be clear," Ms. Parker interrupted, finally looking up. Her blue eyes were cold as ice. "Your presence in this advanced placement class is already unusual. If you can't maintain the academic standards we expect at Westfield, perhaps you should consider transferring to a regular history class." The implication hung heavy in the air. Emma felt her cheeks burn, but years of dealing with subtle prejudice had taught her to maintain her composure. "I understand, Ms. Parker. May I submit a revised version of the essay?" "Oh, I don't think that will be necessary." Ms. Parker's smile was razor-sharp. "I've already emailed your other teachers to discuss your performance issues." Emma's blood ran cold. "You what?" Just a routine check-in about a struggling student. We take academic integrity very seriously here at Westfield." Ms. Parker turned back to her computer. A clear dismissal. "Close the door on your way out." In the hallway, Emma leaned against the wall, trying to steady her breathing. She didn't notice Sarah hovering nearby until the girl spoke. "Hey, Emma?" Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. "I just wanted to say, I read your essay when Ms. Parker was showing it to some other students in the teacher's lounge. It was really good. She's just—" Sarah glanced around nervously. "She's not fair to certain students." Before Emma could respond, Sarah hurried away, leaving Emma with the sickening realization that Ms. Parker wasn't just grading her unfairly. She was actively trying to undermine her across the entire school. During lunch, Emma sat alone at her usual corner table, picking at her food without appetite. Her phone buzzed with a text from her father. "How's your day going, sweetheart? Remember, you're stronger than anyone knows." "Dad." Emma stared at the message, tears threatening to spill. If only her father knew what was happening. But he was so busy with his new position. Working late hours, she barely saw him. Besides, she'd always handled her own battles. What she didn't know was that the worst was yet to come. As she sat there, Ms. Parker was in the faculty lounge, planting seeds of doubt about Emma's academic integrity among the other teachers. But she was about to make a crucial mistake, one that would set in motion a chain of events that would expose years of hidden prejudice at Westfield High. The midterm exam was approaching, and with it, a storm that would change everything. The morning of the midterm exam dawned gray and cold. Students filed into room 204 with nervous energy, clutching coffee cups and last-minute study guides. Emma had spent weeks preparing, knowing this test could make or break her grade, and perhaps her future. Ms. Parker stood at the front of the room, distributing exam booklets with mechanical precision. When she reached Emma's desk, she paused. "I trust you'll remember our discussion about academic integrity, Miss Chen," she said loudly enough for nearby students to hear. "We wouldn't want any misunderstandings." Emma's hands clenched under her desk, but she met Miss Parker's gaze steadily. "Yes, Miss Parker." The exam began. The scratch of pencils and rustle of papers filled the room as students worked through the complex questions about American history. Emma found herself in a rhythm, confidently analyzing historical events and supporting her arguments with evidence she'd meticulously memorized. Halfway through the exam, Ms. Parker began pacing the aisles. She stopped behind Emma's desk, hovering. The shadow cast over Emma's paper made it difficult to read, but she forced herself to concentrate. 20 minutes remaining, Ms. Parker announced, still standing behind Emma. Suddenly, Emma felt a sharp movement near her desk. Ms. Parker had accidentally bumped into her chair, causing Emma's pencil to skid across the page. Several students looked up at the commotion. "Oh dear," Ms. Parker's voice dripped with false concern. "How clumsy of me. But you know, Miss Chen, in college, you'll need to be prepared for all sorts of distractions." Emma took a deep breath and continued writing. But as she flipped to the next page, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The corner of her essay booklet was slightly torn, exactly where Ms. Parker had been standing. When the bell rang, Ms. Parker collected the exams with a satisfied smile. "I'll have these graded by tomorrow. Some of you may be surprised by your results." As students packed up, Sarah lingered behind, waiting until most of the class had left before approaching Emma. "I saw what she did," Sarah whispered hurriedly. "She tore your booklet on purpose. I filmed it on my phone." Emma's eyes widened. "You what?" "I've been recording her for weeks," Sarah admitted, glancing nervously at the door. "The way she treats you, the things she says when she thinks no one's paying attention. I was too scared to say anything before, but Miss Williams?" Ms. Parker's sharp voice cut through their conversation. "Don't you have somewhere to be?" Sarah jumped, quickly gathering her things. She pressed a small USB drive into Emma's hand before hurrying out. Emma stared at the tiny device, her heart pounding. Before she could process what had just happened, Ms. Parker's voice rang out again. "Miss Chen, a word." Emma approached the teacher's desk, the USB drive burning a hole in her pocket. Ms. Parker held up Emma's exam booklet, the torn corner clearly visible. "Care to explain this damage to your exam paper?" Ms. Parker's eyes glinted with malice. "Attempting to remove a page, perhaps? Or maybe inserting one?" "You know exactly how that happened," Emma replied, her voice surprisingly steady. "You tore it yourself." Ms. Parker's smile vanished. "That's a very serious accusation, Miss Chen. One that could have severe consequences for your academic future. But I'm willing to be lenient if you admit to attempting to cheat and withdraw from my class immediately." The injustice of it all hit Emma like a physical blow. Years of staying quiet, of taking the high road, of trying to prove herself worthy, it all came crashing down in that moment. "No." "Excuse me?" Miss Parker's eyebrows shot up. "I said no," Emma repeated, stronger this time. "I won't admit to something I didn't do. And I have proof." She pulled out the USB drive, holding it up. Ms. Parker's face drained of color. "What is that?" "Evidence," Emma replied, "of everything. Today and all the other days. Sarah's been recording your class." Ms. Parker's composure cracked. She snatched for the USB drive, but Emma stepped back quickly. "Give me that right now, or I'll—" "You'll what?" Emma challenged. "Fail me? Report me? Go ahead. I'm done being silent." Ms. Parker's face contorted with rage. "How dare you?" "Do you have any idea who I am at this school? No one will believe the word of a—" She caught herself, but the unspoken slur hung in the air between them. What, Ms. Parker?" Emma's voice was quiet but firm. "Say it. Show everyone who you really are." The classroom door opened, and both of them turned to see Dr. Harrison, the department head, standing in the doorway. "Is everything all right in here?" he asked, looking between them with concern. "I heard raised voices." Ms. Parker's professional mask slipped back into place instantly. "Just discussing Miss Chen's academic dishonesty during today's exam. In fact, I was about to call a parent-teacher conference to address these serious concerns." Emma's heart raced. A parent-teacher conference. Her father. For the first time since this all began, a small smile crossed her face. "Yes," she said. "Let's have that conference. Today, if possible." Ms. Parker smiled triumphantly, missing the glint in Emma's eye. "I'll send for your parents immediately." What Ms. Parker couldn't know, was that she had just set in motion her own downfall. The storm that had been building was about to break, and nothing at Westfield High would ever be the same. The administrative office buzzed with activity as Ms. Parker strode in, radiating an air of authority. She approached Mrs. Collins, the secretary, with a practiced smile. "Please contact Miss Chen's parents immediately. We have an urgent matter to discuss regarding academic misconduct." Mrs. Collins glanced up, looking slightly confused. "Oh, you want me to call Dr. Ch—" "Whatever contact information we have on file," Ms. Parker interrupted impatiently. "Though I doubt we'll reach anyone during work hours. These situations often reflect unstable home environments." Behind her, Emma stood quietly, watching the scene unfold. Her phone felt heavy in her pocket, containing a single text she'd sent moments ago. "Dad, it's time!" The next hour crawled by with excruciating slowness. Miss Parker had gathered an audience. The department head, Dr. Harrison, and 2 other teachers she'd convinced to witness the proceedings. They sat in the conference room, making small talk while waiting for Emma's supposedly unreachable parents. "Well," Ms. Parker sighed dramatically after 20 minutes, "I suppose we should proceed without—" The door opened. The figure that stepped into the room commanded immediate attention. Tall, distinguished, in an impeccably tailored suit, Dr. James Chen carried himself with the quiet authority of someone used to being in charge. Ms. Parker's smile faltered slightly. "I'm sorry, sir, but this is a private meeting regarding a student." "Yes?" Dr. Chen replied calmly. "My daughter, Emma." The color drained from Ms. Parker's face. Dr. Harrison sat up straighter, suddenly very alert. "Your daughter?" Ms. Parker's voice had risen an octave. "Indeed." Dr. Chen took a seat next to Emma, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Though you might know me better, as the new principal of Westfield High." The silence that followed was deafening. The other teachers exchanged alarmed glances. Dr. Harrison looked like he'd swallowed something extremely unpleasant. Ms. Parker's mouth opened and closed several times before she found her voice. I had no idea. You're not... I assumed..." "Yes," Dr. Chen's voice was steel wrapped in silk. "You assumed many things, didn't you, Miss Parker?" He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a tablet. "Before we discuss today's incident, perhaps we should review some footage that's recently come to my attention." Sarah's videos played on the conference room screen. Ms. Parker's voice filled the room. "These people always try to make everything about race. Some students just aren't suited for advanced classes. If she can't handle it, she should go back to wherever she came from." With each clip, Ms. Parker seemed to shrink smaller in her chair. The other teachers watched in horror as weeks of systematic discrimination unfolded before them. "And then," Dr. Chen continued, his voice dangerously quiet, "there's today's midterm incident." The footage clearly showed Ms. Parker deliberately tearing Emma's exam booklet before attempting to accuse her of cheating. I can explain," Ms. Parker stammered. "This is all being taken out of context." "Context?" Emma's voice cut through the room, surprising everyone. She stood, hands steady despite her racing heart. "Like the context of you showing my essays to other teachers, suggesting I was cheating? Or the context of you telling my classmates that I'm probably just a diversity admission?" Dr. Chen raised an eyebrow. "Would you care to explain these actions, Ms. Parker?" "Dr. Chen," she pleaded, "surely you understand the need to maintain academic standards. I was simply discriminating against my daughter based on her race," Dr. Chen finished. "Creating a hostile learning environment? Attempting to sabotage a student's academic career? No, I would never. I didn't know she was Didn't know she was my daughter? And that makes it acceptable?" Dr. Chen's voice could have frozen fire. "Would your behavior have been different if you'd known who she was, who I was?" Ms. Parker's face crumpled as the full impact of her actions and their consequences hit her. "Dr. Harrison," Dr. Chen turned to the department head, "I believe the school board should be notified immediately. And Mrs. Collins," he pressed the intercom button, "please contact our legal department." "This is ridiculous," Ms. Parker burst out, her composure finally shattering completely. "You can't just come in here and—" "Actually," Dr. Chen stood, his full authority radiating through the room, "I can, and I will. This ends today, Ms. Parker. Not just for Emma, but for every student you've discriminated against over the years." The meeting that followed would be talked about in Westfield High's hallways for years to come, but its true impact was only beginning to unfold. News spread through Westfield High like wildfire. By the next morning, the halls buzzed with whispers and wide-eyed stares as Emma walked to her locker. This time, though, the looks were different. A mixture of awe, respect, and more than a little guilt. The school assembly called that morning packed the auditorium to capacity. Students shifted nervously in their seats as Dr. Chen took the podium, his presence commanding attention without effort. "Yesterday," he began, his voice carrying to every corner of the room, "an incident occurred that has forced us to confront some uncomfortable truths about our school community. For too long, we've allowed prejudice to hide behind the mask of academic standards." The screen behind him flickered to life, displaying carefully selected clips from Sarah's recordings. Gasps echoed through the audience as Ms. Parker's true nature was revealed. Some students sank lower in their seats, remembering their own silent complicity. "Ms. Parker has been placed on immediate administrative leave, pending a full investigation," Dr. Chen continued. "But this isn't just about one teacher. This is about the culture we've allowed to flourish through our silence." In the third row, Sarah sat up straighter, tears streaming down her face. Emma, seated near the back, watched as several other students, ones who had witnessed Miss Parker's behavior and said nothing, wiped their eyes. "Starting today," Dr. Chen's voice grew stronger, "Westfield High is implementing comprehensive changes. We're establishing a student diversity council, mandatory cultural sensitivity training for all staff, and an anonymous reporting system for discrimination of any kind." He paused, his eyes scanning the crowd. "But policies alone won't create change. That responsibility lies with each of us. Every time we choose silence over speaking up, we become part of the problem." After the assembly, the hallways hummed with conversation. Groups of students huddled together, discussing what they'd witnessed. Emma found herself surrounded by classmates eager to apologize, to share their own stories, to do better. Sarah approached hesitantly, clutching her books to her chest. "Emma, I'm so sorry I didn't speak up sooner. I was scared, but that's no excuse." Emma smiled gently. "You did speak up, Sarah. Those recordings made a difference. Still," Sarah's voice wavered, "watching it happen day after day, I should have done more." Before Emma could respond, a group of students from their history class joined them. The same ones who had once snickered at Ms. Parker's comments now looked ashamed. "We're starting a study group," one of them offered tentatively, "for the new history teacher. Would you maybe help lead it? Your essays were always really good, even though Ms. Parker... .. The sentence trailed off awkwardly, but Emma understood. "I'd like that," she said. Meanwhile, in the principal's office, Dr. Chen sat across from Ms. Parker and her lawyer. The once confident teacher now looked small, defeated. "Your resignation letter will be accepted immediately, Doctor," Chen stated firmly. "The board has agreed not to press charges, provided you agree to never teach in this district again." Ms. Parker's lawyer nudged her, and she nodded numbly, signing the papers with trembling hands. As she stood to leave, she turned back one last time. "Dr. Chen, I never meant to." "Yes, you did," he cut her off quietly. "You meant every word, every action. The only thing you regret is getting caught." The door closed behind her with a final click, marking the end of an era at Westfield High. Later that evening, Emma found her father in his office, reviewing applications for the new history teacher position. "Dad?" she said softly. He looked up, his eyes warm. "Yes, sweetheart?" "Why didn't you tell me you were becoming principal here?" Dr. Chen set down his papers, considering the question. "I wanted you to have a normal experience, to handle things your way. Maybe that was a mistake." Emma shook her head, moving to perch on the edge of his desk. "No, it wasn't. If everyone had known who I was from the start, we might never have exposed what was really happening here." Her father smiled proudly. "You're stronger than I ever was at your age." "I learned from the best," she replied, hugging him tightly. But their work was far from over. The next day would bring new challenges, new opportunities for change. Westfield High was transforming, and Emma Chen was at the heart of that transformation. 3 months after Ms. Parker's departure, Westfield High had undergone a visible transformation. The change wasn't just in the new posters promoting diversity that lined the hallways or the packed attendance at Cultural Awareness Club meetings. It was in the way students interacted, the conversations they had, and the confidence with which previously silent voices now spoke up. Emma stood at the front of room 204, the same classroom where it had all begun. But now, instead of shrinking under a teacher's prejudiced gaze, she was leading a student panel discussion on civil rights movements throughout American history. "The thing about discrimination," she addressed her peers, her voice clear and confident, "is that it doesn't always announce itself with obvious signs. Sometimes it hides behind standards or traditions or even academic rigor." The new history teacher, Ms. Rodriguez, watched from her desk with approval. She had been carefully selected by Dr. Chen not just for her impressive credentials, but for her commitment to inclusive education. "What happened last semester," Emma continued, "wasn't just about one teacher or one student. It was about all of us, what we choose to accept, what we choose to challenge, and most importantly, what we choose to change." Sarah, now one of Emma's closest friends, raised her hand. "How do we make sure something like this never happens again?" Emma smiled. "By doing exactly what you did, Sarah, speaking up, even when it's scary. Recording evidence, even when it feels easier to look away. Standing together, even when it means standing against authority." After class, students lingered to chat, a mix of faces and backgrounds that would have been unlikely to interact just a few months ago. The study group Emma led had become one of the most popular in school, not just for academic support, but for the open discussions it fostered. In the faculty lounge, teachers attended regular sensitivity training sessions. The old guard, who had initially resisted such unnecessary changes, had either adapted or followed Ms. Parker's exit. The new atmosphere was one of genuine inclusion and respect. Dr. Chen's office door remained consistently open, with a steady stream of students and teachers coming to share concerns, ideas, and progress reports. The anonymous reporting system he'd implemented had already prevented several incidents of discrimination from escalating. One afternoon, as spring began to touch the campus with new life, Emma found herself back in the administrative office. But this time, she wasn't alone. She stood with the newly formed Student Diversity Council, presenting their proposals for the next academic year. "We've designed a peer mentoring program," she explained to the board members, pairing incoming freshmen with upperclassmen from similar backgrounds. No student should ever feel isolated or unwelcome at Westfield. The board members, more diverse now thanks to recent appointments, nodded approvingly. Among them sat Sarah's mother, who had been inspired by her daughter's actions to become more involved in school governance. After the meeting, Doctor, Chen found Emma sitting on the steps outside his office, watching students cross the courtyard. "Penny for your thoughts?" he asked, joining her. Emma turned to her father, smiling. "I was just thinking about that first day, standing outside Ms. Parker's classroom. I was so scared, trying to be invisible. Now look at us." Dr. Chen squeezed her shoulder gently. "You never needed to be invisible, Emma. You just needed the space to shine." "We all did," she replied, watching a group of freshmen, a rainbow of faces and backgrounds, laughing together as they headed to lunch. "Sometimes it takes a storm to clear the air." The next morning, a new student arrived at Westfield High. Like Emma months before, she stood nervously in the hallway, clutching her schedule. But unlike Emma's experience, she was immediately approached by a member of the Student Welcome Committee. "Hi, I'm Emma," she introduced herself warmly. "Welcome to Westfield. Things are different here now." And they were. The old Westfield, with its hidden prejudices and silent acceptances, was gone. In its place stood a school that had learned its lessons the hard way, but had emerged stronger, more inclusive, and truly committed to education in its purest form. As Emma led the new student to her first class, they passed by room 204. The door was open, voices spilling out, a mixture of accents, perspectives, and ideas, all equally valued, all equally heard. "You know," Emma told the new student, "someone once told me that education isn't about silencing voices or dismissing perspectives. It's about expanding our understanding and learning from diverse experiences." "Who told you that?" the new student asked. Emma smiled. "My dad. But more importantly, we all learned it together." On the wall outside room 204, a new plaque had been installed. It read, "Education is not just about what we learn, but about who we become in the process." Westfield High School, where every voice matters. The story of Emma Chen and Ms. Parker would be retold many times over the years at Westfield High. Not as a scandal or a tragedy, but as a turning point. The moment when a school community decided that silence in the face of prejudice was no longer an option. And in classrooms across Westfield High, students continued to raise their hands, speak their truths, and learn from each other, not despite their differences, but because of them. The plaque outside room 204 tells more than a story of prejudice exposed. It tells of transformation, how one voice of courage sparked a chorus of change. Westfield High's journey didn't end with Ms. Parker's departure. It lives on in every raised hand once kept down, every perspective now valued, every new student who walks these halls knowing they belong. The most powerful lesson wasn't found in any history book. It was written in the courage of those who chose to speak up, the strength of those who dared to listen, and the change that happened when silence was no longer an option. Because at Westfield High, every voice matters, and that makes all the difference. Thank you for taking time to witness this story with us. If this story touched your heart, share your thoughts in the comments. Every story we share is meant to move and transform. If you found inspiration in today's tale, simply leave a 9 below. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that remind us of our shared humanity. Until our next story unfolds,